Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing the laws of war, humanitarian law, and how these principles apply in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. War is always monstrous, and in order to rein in some of the horrors of war, international legal doctrines have developed to apply to armed conflict and humanitarian crises. As the conflict in Ukraine escalates and Russia faces international sanctions, many people are wondering what international laws apply. What recourse is there to legal institutions for the war of aggression, for example? Here to discuss this are three legal experts. Eugene Choli is a Canadian lawyer and former president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Brian Lee Cox is a lecturer at Cornell Law School, specialized in the law of armed conflict. And Kaveh Shahruz is a lawyer and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Mr. Choli, let me first express my feelings of horror and sympathy about what's happening right now in Ukraine. Could you give our viewers a sense of what it is like right now for the people in Ukraine?
Essentially, I think that the Russian forces have realized that Ukraine has put up a formidable and courageous defense. And President Putin has decided to inflict as much suffering and pain on the civilian population and is bombarding indiscriminately military and civilian infrastructure and causing tremendous pain and suffering to Ukrainians living in Ukraine. That is probably, in a nutshell, how I best describe the situation.
Absolutely horrible.
I can just give you one example of such a horrific approach to the situation. Last Saturday, for instance, there was a missile that hit a specialized children's hospital in Ukraine, killing one child and injuring three more. Just
terrible. Professor Cox, or Mr. Cox, I want to get into some of these legal doctrines. And there's one called a war of aggression. So what is a war of aggression? How's it defined in international law? And do you think it applies here with this invasion?
So the definition of aggression was first officially adopted in 1974 by the United Nations General Assembly. And the definition from there was just a violation of the UN Charter, specifically Article 2, Sub 4 of the Charter. So Article 2, Sub 4, if we go to the Charter, the United Nations Charter, prohibits states from using the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. And so that was the initial definition. It's since been kind of updated a bit in the Rome Statute, which was first adopted in 1998, the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. But the definition of aggression, or the crime of aggression, has been recently added to the Rome Statute. It was adopted in the 2010 Kampala Amendment. So the key language there is that a threat or use of force against another state is a crime of aggression if it's a manifest violation of the UN Charter. The definition of manifest is kind of intentionally vague, but so there's some bit of wiggle room for political leaders in making decisions on when to use force. So that's the definition. Whether it applies here, I find it really difficult to make an argument that this use of force by Russia against Ukraine doesn't qualify as a manifest violation of the UN Charter.
Mr. Shahruz, what's your take? Do you think that this invasion of Ukraine rises to the level of a crime of aggression under international law?
Yeah, so subject to the general vagueness of the term manifest, I think, putting that aside, I think this is almost a dictionary definition. It's a textbook case of a crime of aggression, right? Here you've got a political leader and his military commanders attacking the sovereignty and the political independence of a separate country. If we don't consider this a crime of aggression, I'm not really sure what that crime exists for, why it's been added to the books. So I absolutely think that this meets the definition. Now, whether or not a court like the International Criminal Court can take jurisdiction, I doubt that.
We've got to go to commercial, but we'll get into some questions like that when we come back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the current conflict, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and how the international laws of war and armed conflict might apply. Now, Mr. Cox, the International Criminal Court has now announced that they have started an investigation into the Russian invasion. In fact, dating back years prior to their invasion of Crimea, which is a peninsula in southern Ukraine. What could an investigation lead to ultimately, and what's this going to entail?
That's a really great question because the ICC, the International Criminal Court, it's a treaty-based judicial body, and so it relies on the consensus of states that have ratified, or countries that have ratified the founding treaty, the Rome Statute. Ukraine has not ratified the Rome Statute, so it's not a state party, but it can request that the ICC initiate an investigation, potentially even a prosecution.
And to be clear, Russia hasn't ratified it either, correct?
Russia has not either. Now, one kind of interesting development and encouraging development is that states, so there are 123 countries that have ratified the Rome Statute, and Canada is one of them. Many states, including Canada, has recently been announced that the states party have requested that the ICC actually look into crimes in the potentially being committed in Ukraine. So I think this is going to really entail kind of two separate types of international crimes. One would be war crimes. And so this would be the conduct of hostilities, Russian and potentially Ukrainian and other troops who are on the ground or in the territory actually engaged in hostilities. Are those soldiers, are those troops complying with their obligations pursuant to the law of armed conflict? So that would be one aspect of an investigation, a potential prosecution. And another aspect will be whether whether the initial decision to invade Ukraine constitutes a crime of aggression, who is responsible for that, and if people are found responsible, how to bring them before the court.
Now, Mr. Charouz, in the last segment, you expressed some skepticism about the effectiveness of the ICC in dealing with this. What's your concern here?
My concern is, as Mr. Cox was just mentioning, the lack of jurisdiction, particularly given that Russia, A, is not a state party. So that poses a problem. And secondly, it has veto power on the UN Security Council, which is another path by which you would potentially be able to get yourself to the ICC. So I think that poses a real problem. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the ICC is a criminal court, right? And it can't really, even if it got over the jurisdiction problem, it wouldn't be able to do what it does unless it actually has defendants in the docket, right? So until such time that Mr. Putin is arrested, detained, and handed over to The Hague, I'm not really sure that he, who's the main culprit, I would say, of this crime, I don't know if we're necessarily going to get justice from the ICC.
Could he be detained if he was traveling outside of Russia into a party state?
I think that is possible, but again, I think the jurisdictional issues with Russia not being a signatory to the Rome Statute would be tremendous.
Mr. Choli, what's your view on the role that the International Criminal Court can play here? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the role it can play in helping get redress for some of these really appalling things we've been hearing about during this conflict?
I think, as my predecessors have indicated, there are certainly legal challenges that need to be addressed, including the jurisdiction issue and the fact that Russia has not ratified the convention. But that being said, I think that as in just about every other field of law, I think solutions will be found in an ingenious way in order for crime not to remain unpunished.
Mr. Charouz, I want to chat briefly about the laws of armed conflict. What are some of the things that you've been hearing? Just really briefly, we've got about a minute, and we'll get into it further in the next segment. What are some of the things that might violate some of these rules governing armed conflict in Ukraine?
So the laws of armed conflict, the main document that you would look to would be the Geneva Conventions. And among the key obligations of states there is to protect civilians or not needlessly target civilians. So the news coming out of Ukraine with almost indiscriminate shelling of residential neighborhoods, at least that's the allegation, and it seems to be a credible allegation. I think that's really one of the key concerns about war crimes that are being committed by Russian forces against Ukrainian civilians, and that would constitute a war crime under international law.
And I've also read some reports about some pretty appalling weapons, cluster bombs and these other terrible weapons. We'll chat about those in the next segment. We've got to go to commercial break, but I want to continue this conversation. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the laws of war and armed conflict and how they apply to the current situation in Ukraine. Now, Mr. Choli, I want to address some of the reports we've been hearing on the different types of weapons that are being deployed by the Russian military. I've heard about, cluster bombs. I've heard about this weapon called a thermobaric weapon, which is kind of like a vacuum bomb. And then, of course, there's the literal nuclear option that so many people are concerned about after the reports that Putin had raised a nuclear alert. What restrictions are there on the types of weapons that can be used in armed conflict, and when the use of those weapons might constitute a war crime?
Clearly, under Section 51 of the Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, indiscriminate bombardment, which we are seeing on TV every single day, is a violation of the protocol. So that, as a starter, is one very clear violation. Under the Rome Statute, a war crime includes unnecessary destruction of property and of obviously of civilians. So in this particular case, we are seeing that played out day in, day out. And yesterday's incredible shelling of a nuclear power plant was absolutely unthinkable by any means and any criteria one wants to use.
Mr. Cox, I want to talk about this nuclear power plant attack that's happened. When would the bombing of a nuclear facility constitute a war crime? And when would, some of the reports that we're hearing is a concern that the Russian forces will shut off access to electricity as a means of sort of terrorizing the Ukrainian civilian population. Which would either of these constitute a war crime, and if so, when?
Right. So I haven't heard any reports on what the objective was, whether the attack was directed at the actual, say, the nuclear reactors or the nuclear facility, or whether they were trying to take control of the facility, and in the process, the shells, the artillery shells, landed near the facility where the nuclear reactors are. So a lot of it is going to hinge on the intent of the attack. Now, if Russian forces were, say, bombing this facility for the purpose of creating a nuclear explosion or releasing nuclear fallout to the population, that would very likely constitute a war crime because it would be seen to be excessive. The incidental damage that would be expected would seem to be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage, and I don't think there would be really any way around that. But a lot of it, again, is going to depend on what the intent was. If now, in terms of using the electricity as a means to, so the possibility of shutting off the electricity as a means to terrorize the population, that in itself, if the intent again is to terrorize the population in order to get the population to stop fighting, that could be a violation. But again, a lot of it's going to depend on the intent. We would have to find out what that electricity is being used to supply. Is it what's called in military terms a dual use object, that's a military objective and a civilian object? So there would be a lot of analysis that need to go into it, but so a lot of it will depend on what the intent is and what we learn about that.
Mr. Charouz, we've got about a minute. I want your take on some of the reports we're hearing about treatments of prisoners, either prisoners that Russian forces captured by Ukrainians or Ukrainian forces captured by Russians. What laws govern the treatment of prisoners of war, and why are those laws important? Just briefly.
Yeah, the primary law on this is the Third Geneva Convention that deals with prisoners of war. And one of the key requirements of that is that prisoners of war not be subjected to various things, medical experimentation, torture, and so on, but also not be made a public curiosity. So, videos, for example, that seem to be circulating online of various soldiers that have been captured, those come up to the line, I think, of that. And some of it, I think, is just individuals on the ground that are recording these, uploading that. Obviously, that's not a state responsibility. But if Ukrainian authorities or Russian authorities are filming POWs, putting them online in an attempt to intimidate them in some way, I think that would violate the Third Geneva Convention.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the laws of war and how they apply to the crisis in Ukraine. Mr. Charouz, there have been a lot of reports of the bombing of civilian areas in Ukraine. So what laws apply to the targeting civilians versus the targeting of things that might be dual purpose, like infrastructure, bridges, communication, or military buildings as targets? And when civilians are harmed in those attacks, sort of as an incidental death?
So typically what you would look to in this situation would be both the Geneva Conventions and also customary international law. And basically the rule is that attacks should be directed at legitimate military targets, right? Civilians should not be ever the direct targets of an attack. Now, it's possible, the international law does allow for occasional civilian deaths, but the requirement there is that the military advantage that's anticipated be greater. The proportionality test is really what's key here. A lot of the answer to the question of whether or not what Russia's been doing amounts to a war crime will obviously depend on the facts and circumstances. But if there is a situation where they are deliberately targeting civilians, that is obviously a war crime. And if there are cases where they're going after infrastructure, where the anticipated military advantage is minor, but the number of civilians that will be harmed or killed is great, that also will meet the definition of a war crime.
Mr. Choli, have you been hearing reports about what might look like intentional targeting of civilians, though?
Absolutely. And the advantage that we have being and witnessing this in 2022 is that we see this on TV every single day. And clearly we are seeing shelling of densely populated civilian areas backed by any means and any criteria, whether it's the Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, whether it's the Rome Statute, customary law, under any circumstance, in a conflictual situation, one does not attack a civilian population. If there's an accident, that is your incidental or collateral damage. But in this particular instance, on a daily basis, we are seeing a civilian infrastructure being targeted time and again and again and again.
Mr. Cox, just very briefly, what's your take on that issue?
Yeah, so I agree. And a lot of what it's going to come down to is intent after the fact. So there's a lot of intelligence and evidence being generated and collected in large part because Russian forces don't appear to have the capability to use secure communications. And so there's a lot of unsecured comms that are being intercepted. And so this is going to, I think, kind of after the fact, when we're trying to parse, was this attack or was that attack intentionally directed against the civilian population, or did we care about the proportionality rule, for example? A lot of it is going to come down to intent, and fortunately, I think in this scenario, there's not going to be a shortage of evidence.
We've only got a minute left. Mr. Choli, what can people do who are concerned about this? Are there any charities that you'd recommend people look into if they want to help?
I would recommend two charities. One is with the Ukrainian World Congress, and the other one is if you go on the site of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress.
Kaveh, anything you'd like to add? Any charities you'd recommend?
I echo the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, and I think anytime that you make a donation to the International Committee of the Red Cross, that's helpful, especially in times of war.
And Mr. Cox, do you have a recommendation for where people can donate if they want to help?
Same for those, but also I would look at the Canadian chapter of the Red Cross and potentially the UN Refugee Agency Canada, which is at unhcr.ca.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for coming on today. It's a really serious and terrible topic, and I appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We've heard today about the laws of war and armed conflict and how they apply to the current situation in Ukraine. My heart goes out to the Ukrainian people. I have many Ukrainian friends, including first-generation immigrants. This war is unjustified aggression, and many people are suffering and dying as a result of Putin's decision to invade a peaceful country. Please consider making a donation to one of the organizations that our guest mentioned today to help the people of Ukraine and use your voice to say how wrong this war is. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.